Why was everyone so sure she didn't belong? The question had followed Rachel Keane from base to base, country to country, year after year. 15 years in uniform, 3 tours across continents, and still, every time she stepped into a new room, there were eyes that measured her in the same way. Too quiet, too plain, too easy to dismiss. She had learned not to answer the question with words. Words could be ignored. Actions had a way of burning themselves into memory. But today, at Fort Wexler, the question pressed heavier than usual. The morning air carried the mix she'd known since childhood, that cocktail of jet fuel and pine that only military families understood. Sharp, metallic, edged with heat even at dawn. Her boots hit cracked asphalt, each step deliberate, controlled, like she'd practiced this walk 1,000 times. Around her the base pulsed with noise, the chants of PT drills rolling across the yard, the heavy clang of steel against steel, the low hum of engines. It should have been familiar, but something about Wexler was different. This wasn't just another base. This was a proving ground. Navy SEALs, Rangers, Marine Raiders, Air Force PJs, all of them rotating through, sharpening claws, testing each other, pretending to cooperate while quietly competing. The kind of place where reputations were made and broken in whispers that spread faster than orders. She knew what that meant. It meant people watched every move, waiting for the first stumble. And when you wore an Army patch in a Navy-heavy crowd, they wanted you to stumble. Rachel walked with the quiet efficiency of someone who didn't need an audience. Her uniform was crisp, regulation perfect, her sidearm riding on her hip like it belonged there. She moved without swagger, without the exaggerated confidence others liked to parade. But her eyes never stopped scanning. Guard towers, blind corners, exit routes. That instinct hadn't left her, not since the places where forgetting to look over your shoulder meant you never came home. The armory door groaned open. Gun oil, disinfectant, sweat. The layered scent hit her in a wave, and with it the laughter. 4 men stood behind the wire mesh counter, their posture relaxed, their amusement obvious. Navy blue shirts clung to them like uniforms designed for arrogance. She recognized the dynamic instantly, the tight little pack, bonded by months of moving and fighting together, each one reinforcing the other's certainty that they were untouchable. Lieutenant Cain spotted her first. Tall, blonde, built like he'd been carved for a recruitment poster. His pale eyes swept her in a single practiced glance, the kind men used when they thought they could assess a soldier's worth in one heartbeat. He smirked. "Well, well," he said loudly, for his buddies as much as for her. "Look what the Army sent us. Hope she knows which end of the rifle the bullets come out of." The others snorted. Petty Officer Ricks leaned his heavy frame on the counter, his hands scarred but sure. Chief Daniels, older, more weathered, gave a thin grin that didn't reach his eyes. Corporal Vega, jittery, practically bounced with energy he couldn't control. "Don't worry, LT," Ricks said. "We'll keep her safe. Make sure she doesn't trip over her laces." "Maybe get her a manual," Vega added. "Weapons for dummies." Rachel didn't blink, didn't rise. She simply signed for her rifle, pulled it across the counter, and began her inspection routine. Chamber check, sight alignment, sling adjustment. Her hands moved like water, precise, steady, betraying nothing of the irritation building in her chest. She'd heard this song before. Different languages, different accents, always the same rhythm, always the same chorus. "Easy there, killer," Daniels said dryly. "Those training rounds won't bite unless you point them right." More chuckles, more little jabs, designed not to hurt, but to remind her of her place in their imagined hierarchy. She slung the rifle without a word. "Guess we'll find out," she said softly. Cain leaned toward the others, his voice pitched low but not low enough. $20 says she folds the first time someone gets aggressive." Rachel's boots carried her toward the briefing room. She let the words hang. She had been underestimated by men sharper, louder, crueler than these 4. And in every case, reality had caught up with them eventually. She didn't need to prove them wrong. Life would do it for her. The briefing hall was an old hangar repurposed into order. concrete floor, metal rafters, folding chairs arranged like rows of teeth. A whiteboard dominated one wall, covered in scrawled diagrams: today's exercise, an urban breach and clear. She chose a seat in the second row, not too close, not too far, enough to see everything without being a spectacle. Clusters formed instantly. Rangers to the left, SEALs in the back, Marines in knots of easy bravado. The four commandos sprawled near the rear, Cain's boots propped arrogantly on the chair in front of him. His voice carried as he explained something to the others, tone dripping with the authority of a man who thought people should be grateful just to hear him speak. The door opened, silence followed. Major Billings entered with precise steps, lean and gray-haired, the kind of officer who commanded without raising his voice. Conversations died in his wake. He began outlining the exercise: four-person assault team, timed breach, sim rounds, painful enough to demand respect, not lethal. Rachel's pen scratched quietly across her notepad. She already knew the drill. She'd run it in real alleys with real bullets and real consequences. But training was training. Repetition sharpened the blade. "Sorry." The interruption snapped her focus upward. Cain. His tone held false respect, his grin thin. "Since today's exercise is about adaptability under stress, why don't we give the Army rep here a little extra challenge?" Billings froze mid-sentence. The room shifted. Soldiers leaned forward. Everyone smelled the coming spectacle. "What kind of challenge, Lieutenant?" Cain's grin widened. "Strip her weapons. Let her run it unarmed. See how she adapts when she doesn't have her security blanket." The words floated in the air, heavy with condescension, waiting for impact. Daniels leaned in. "Could be good training, sir. Real world doesn't always give you time to grab your rifle." "Level the field a little," Rix added smoothly. Vega just snickered. Rachel sat still, heart rate steady, though her mind calculated angles at lightning speed. This wasn't training. This was theater. They wanted to humiliate her, strip her competence down to nothing, and let the crowd watch her crumble. "That's not how the scenario is designed," she said evenly. "This is breach and clear, not hand-to-hand." "Exactly," Cain said. "So if she can still pull her weight, that proves something, doesn't it?" The silence was sharp. Billings's jaw worked. He'd dealt with Cain before. Men like him thrived on pushing boundaries. They mistook arrogance for boldness. They thought rules were flexible for people as talented as themselves. "Fine," Billings said finally, his voice clipped. "We'll try it. Sergeant Keane, surrender your weapons. You're going in unarmed." The order sliced through the room. Refuse, and she'd look insubordinate in front of 50 witnesses. Comply, and she'd give the commandos exactly what they wanted: her on her knees, stripped of tools, a pawn in their game. Rachel rose, her movements slow, deliberate. She lifted her rifle, carried it to the front, set it down with care. Then the sidearm, holster empty, options reduced. Not submission, not defeat, just acknowledgement of the moment. The commandos grinned. Rix whispered something to Vega. Cain leaned back smugly, already imagining the victory. Rachel sat down again, her face unreadable. The whispering around the room grew louder. Soldiers shifting in chairs, some entertained, some disgusted, some curious. And up above, in the shadows of the observation deck, more figures gathered. Word was spreading. The Army sergeant was about to get torn apart. Rachel breathed in, slow, controlled. Her mind began shifting gears. Not weapons, not firepower, but leverage, timing, precision. She cataloged them in silence: joints, pressure points, gear they carried. She remembered things most of them had never seen. Small rooms in foreign cities where survival depended on knowing exactly how to dismantle an armed man with nothing but your bare hands. If they wanted a show, she would give them one. Not for pride, not for revenge, but because some lessons couldn't be spoken, they had to be lived. The whistle would blow soon. And in less than 2 minutes, 4 men who thought they understood power were going to learn what helplessness really looked like. What kind of soldier walks into combat with empty hands? That was the question running through the bleachers, whispered from lip to lip as eyes fixed on Rachel Keane. She stood at the edge of the staging mat, her gloves snug against her wrists, the sound of straps tightening crisp in the cavernous warehouse. Above her, the observation deck was crowded shoulder to shoulder, instructors, trainees, curious onlookers, all waiting for the moment when the army sergeant would fail. Some faces were amused, others almost pitying. But not a single one expected her to walk out with her head high. The commandos knew it. Cain carried himself like a man already savoring the victory. His weapon slammed into place with unnecessary force, the metallic click echoing as punctuation to his arrogance. Daniel stretched his shoulders, cracking his neck with a predator's calm. Rix leaned back, fists pumping in quiet confidence. Vega bounced on his toes, jittery, grinning, convinced this was going to be a spectacle he would tell stories about for years. "Try to keep up, Keane," Daniels called, his voice carrying easily across the space. "Wouldn't want you to get lost before the fun starts." Rachel didn't respond, not with a word, not with even a glance. She knelt, one knee pressing into the mat, adjusting her gloves with methodical care. Every movement deliberate, unhurried. If she'd heard the taunt, she didn't let it register. Her focus wasn't on them, it was on the room. The angles of the plywood walls, the shadows cast by humming fluorescent lights, the subtle sounds of gear shifting against fabric. Details small to most, vital to her. She was cataloging weaknesses. Not theirs. Theirs were obvious: confidence, predictability, the certainty of men who thought victory was predetermined. She'd seen it before, in alleys, in bunkers, in places where hubris had been the last thing a man felt before silence took him forever. No, she was cataloging her own. The limits, the fragility, the fragile edge she walked now. She had no rifle, no pistol, no blade hidden in her boot. All she carried was memory, muscle memory carved through a decade of repetition, and the steady calm of someone who knew panic was a weapon you handed to your enemy. She closed her eyes for a moment. Inhale, exhale. She remembered faces, not theirs, not here, other faces. Men in stairwells, smoke in a basement hallway, a knife she'd taken from a hand that shook with adrenaline. She remembered the sound of bone breaking under precise pressure, the flash of surprise in eyes that thought they were the predator until they were. She opened her eyes again. If they wanted to strip her of everything, then everything she had left would have to be enough. Major Billings's voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "Team Alpha, stack at the entry point. Objective is the green crate in the center room. 3 minutes on the clock. Begin on my whistle." The commandos fell into formation, textbook perfect. Cain at the front, rifle up, Daniels on his shoulder, Rix behind, Vega anchoring. 4 bodies moving as one, confident in the rhythm drilled into them 100 times. Rachel stood 5 paces back, close enough to count as part of the team, far enough back to be forgotten the moment the whistle blew, exactly where they wanted her, exactly where she chose to be. Up above, whispers floated. 79 seconds I give her. She won't last 30. This is going to be ugly. Rachel rolled her shoulders, shifting into a stance that looked almost casual, but her weight was balanced, her breathing controlled, every muscle aligned for movement. She was already calculating, not if she would fight, but when. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The whistle shrieked through the warehouse. The commandos surged forward, boots pounding, rifles sweeping, the sound of synchronized movement echoing through plywood corridors. The crowd leaned in, expecting to watch an inevitable demolition. Rachel didn't follow. Not directly. She cut left, hugging the wall, her steps silent, controlled, a shadow moving parallel to theirs. She let them take the lead, let them charge forward while she slid into the blind spots their own momentum created. They thought numbers gave them power, but numbers created patterns. Patterns could be broken. 20 seconds. The first turn loomed, a sharp left into what the map called the alley. Vega swung wide, rifle forward, but his six unguarded. A rookie's mistake, though Vega wasn't a rookie. Overconfidence made veterans sloppy too. Rachel moved like smoke. Her left hand clamped the barrel of his rifle, her right twisting his wrist with surgical precision. Not breaking, controlling. His body jerked, air sucked from his lungs, his balance stolen in a heartbeat. She pulled, pivoted, and his body crashed to the mat with a grunt. The sound echoed, sharp, unexpected. Gasps rose from the observation deck. Before Vega could recover, she stripped the rifle from his grip, rolled it across the mat, and kept moving. 32 seconds. Rick spun, eyes wide, bringing his weapon up. Too slow. Rachel was inside his guard, the captured rifle now a lever hooking behind his knee. A sharp sweep and gravity betrayed him. He slammed to the mat, air rushing from his chest. She dropped her knee across his sternum, pinning him with calculated weight, her hand sliding across his neck in a blood choke. His hand slapped against the mat in frantic taps. Out. 45 seconds. Cain's voice barked a curse. He swung his rifle, but the narrow corridor betrayed him. The weapon snagged, its length suddenly a liability. Rachel moved in a blur, a sidestep, a shoulder into his ribs, a sweep of her foot behind his ankle. His body slammed into plywood with bone-jarring force. The rifle ripped from his grip before he even realized it was gone. 62 seconds. Cain froze, shock flickering across his face as he found himself staring down the muzzle of his own weapon. Confusion, anger, and beneath it something he'd never expected to feel toward her, respect. Daniels came last. He'd heard enough chaos to know subtlety was over. He charged fast, low, arms wide for a tackle. Rachel didn't resist. She pivoted, dropped her center of gravity, let his momentum carry him. Her hips shifted. His body lifted. For a breathless moment, he was airborne, weightless, before crashing onto the mat with a teeth-rattling thud. 77 seconds. She stripped his sidearm, racked the slide, pressed the barrel to his chest from 3 feet away. 79 seconds. The whistle blew. Silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, heavy, impossible. The crowd above hung frozen, disbelief carved into their faces. 4 commandos, elite operators, men who had walked in certain of victory, now lay sprawled across the mat, weapons stripped, pride fractured. Rachel stood, slowly, calmly. She reversed the pistol, offered it back to Daniel's grip first, and stepped away. No gloating, no smile, just the same deliberate calm she'd carried into the warehouse. The timer glowed red above the entry, 79 seconds. On the observation deck, murmurs spread like fire in dry grass. How did you say? 4 of them, man, 4. Cain pushed himself upright, his shoulder aching, his breath ragged. Daniel stayed down longer, staring at the ceiling as if it might explain what had just happened. Vega cradled his wrist, shame and confusion warring on his face. Rix avoided everyone's eyes, suddenly fascinated by his own boots. Rachel said nothing. Her silence was louder than any victory cry. Somewhere in the crowd, a slow clap began. Not mocking, not theatrical, commanding. A deliberate rhythm that drew every eye to the man descending the stairs. Colonel Abrams. Broad-shouldered, dress greens immaculate, silver eagles gleaming under fluorescent light. His presence shifted the room. Soldiers straightened instinctively. Even the commandos froze, shame locked across their faces. Didn't expect to see Falcon back on the mats, Abrams said, his voice cutting across the silence. The name hit like a shockwave. Cain's head snapped up, Daniel's jaw clenched, Rix blinked, Vega stopped moving. Falcon. Not a nickname you got in training, not a name spoken lightly. It was a call sign whispered only in certain circles, the kind of designation earned in missions that never made the news. Rachel's face didn't change. Been a while, sir. 10 years, Abrams asked. 10, she said softly. The colonel turned to the commandos. Gentlemen, you may be interested to know Staff Sergeant Keane here served as lead close quarters instructor for a NATO task force specializing in neutralizing multiple armed opponents in confined spaces. Some of you may be using her own protocols without even realizing it. The transformation was instant. Cain's arrogance drained like water down a cracked pipe. Vega looked like he might be sick. Rick swallowed hard. Daniel's eyes darted away. Respect wasn't demanded, it was earned. And in 79 seconds, Rachel Keane had earned it the way she always had. Not with speeches, not with swagger, but with the quiet, unflinching language of action. How long does silence last when it's heavier than applause? The whistle had stopped. The fight was over. But in the warehouse, the quiet pressed down like a weight none of them could shake. 4 commandos sprawled in defeat, bruised in body and pride, and one woman stood calm, her gloves already stripped from her hands. Rachel Keane didn't look around for approval, didn't meet the eyes of the recruits staring from the observation deck. She walked to the gear rack with the same deliberate pace she'd carried all day, hung up the borrowed rifle, and slid her gloves inside her belt. She moved like nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had. Everyone felt it. Up above, voices whispered in disbelief, trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. 4 of them. No way. She didn't even look tired. Others chuckled nervously, the kind of laughter that hid uncertainty. A few just stared, wide-eyed, realizing they'd just seen something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. On the mat, Cain pressed a hand to his ribs, the memory of hitting the plywood still raw. His face was red, more from shame than pain. Rix busied himself with equipment that didn't need adjusting. Vega rubbed his wrist, avoiding every gaze. Daniel stayed seated for long seconds, eyes locked on the ground, as if standing too soon would make the defeat realer than he could stomach. And Rachel, she didn't linger to gloat. She didn't savor their embarrassment. She just collected her gear, secured her empty holsters, and walked toward the exit. It was Colonel Abrams's voice that had shifted everything. Falcon, a single word that cracked the air like a whip. The call sign had hung there, echoing, heavy with meaning. A secret dragged into the open in front of everyone. The younger soldiers didn't understand. They only saw the effect. They saw Cain's arrogance collapse. They saw Daniel's freeze. They saw the silence settle like truth. But the older instructors on the deck, they knew. Their eyes had widened at the name, not at the fight, because Falcon wasn't just a label, it was a history. Rachel didn't acknowledge any of it, not the whispers, not the stares. She stepped into the sunlight, boots hitting tarmac that shimmered with heat, and let the door shut behind her. Outside, the base continued its rhythm. Soldiers lined up for PT, instructors shouted cadence, engines hummed at the motor pool. The day marched forward, indifferent to what had just unfolded inside, but everywhere she walked she felt it, the shift. Eyes following her now, not with dismissal but with something else. Not admiration, not yet. Respect maybe, or curiosity sharpened by unease. She passed a group of young soldiers near the supply depot. One gave her a small nod, tentative but real. Another straightened his posture as she walked by, as if remembering that uniforms don't always tell the whole story. She didn't return the gestures beyond a slight lift of her chin. Respect earned through demonstration was fragile. It grew stronger in silence than under the spotlight. Inside the depot, the supply sergeant looked up from his paperwork. A man with 20 years etched into his face, his eyes tired but sharp. "Heard you stirred things up at the warehouse," he said. Not mocking, not disrespectful, just a tone of faint amusement, like he'd seen the dance of egos enough times to know how it usually ended. Rachel gave the ghost of a smile. "Just ran the exercise, Sergeant." "Uh-huh." He signed the checkout slip, slid it across the counter. "That's one way to put it." She stepped back into the sunlight. For her, it was over. Another exercise. Another lesson learned the hard way by men who should have known better, but for Fort Wexler it was just beginning. By evening chow, the story had spread across the compound like wildfire. Recruits whispered about the sergeant who dismantled 4 SEALs in less than 2 minutes. Marines scoffed but secretly replayed the details. Airmen wanted to know who Falcon was, and Cain's unit. They sat quieter than usual, eating without their usual banter, the air heavy around them. Rachel ate alone, she always had, forks scraping against the metal tray, boots resting steady on the tile floor. She kept her head down, but her ears caught pieces of conversation. Her name, her fight, her silence. None of it mattered. What mattered was the work, the next exercise, the next drill. She'd long since learned that reputation was smoke. It looked solid, but one good wind and it was gone. Skill was the only thing that stayed. Still, as she lay in her bunk that night, staring at the cracked ceiling of the barracks, she couldn't shake the colonel's word. Falcon. She had buried that name. Years ago, in places that didn't exist on maps, where missions had no records and outcomes were measured in whispers. She had carried the weight of being Falcon then, the close-quarters specialist who walked into rooms stacked against her and walked out when no one expected her to. She had taught men who thought they couldn't be taught. She had built systems, protocols, drills that still lived in training manuals across Europe. And then she had walked away. Why? That was a story she never told. Not to her fellow soldiers, not to commanding officers, not even to herself, not fully. All she knew was that one day the cost had outweighed the mission, and she'd traded the Falcon call sign for the quiet anonymity of an Army staff sergeant moving from base to base, doing the work without drawing attention. Until today. The memory pulled at her. She remembered the first time she'd earned the name. It hadn't been in training. It had been in a narrow alley in a city whose name never made the news. 4 armed men cornering her team, gunfire in the dark. She moved faster than thought, her hands finding weapons, joints, throats. When it was over, the team leader had looked at her and said one word: Falcon. It stuck. She hated it at first. Names like that carried weight. They made you a symbol, and symbols got people killed. But over time, she wore it like armor, until the day she couldn't anymore. Now, lying in the dark, she felt that armor stir again. She didn't want it, but the colonel's voice had pulled it back into the open, and she knew what that meant. Once Falcon was spoken aloud, doors opened, and not all of them led to safe places. Sleep didn't come easily. Her body wanted rest, but her mind replayed the day, the taunts, the stripped weapons. The moment she decided silence wasn't enough anymore. She thought of Cain's face when his confidence cracked. She thought of Daniel's tapping against the mat, desperate for breath. She thought of the crowd's stunned silence. And she thought of the colonel's eyes, sharp, measuring, almost like he'd planned it. The next morning, whispers followed her again. Not mocking this time. Different. Soldiers moved out of her way in the mess hall. Recruits fell silent when she walked past. Respect was harder to carry than disrespect. It set expectations. It made people look to you in ways you hadn't asked for. She went through the day as usual, training, inspections, drills, but every movement carried an invisible shadow, the Falcon shadow. That evening, as the sun dropped low and shadows stretched long across the compound, she found herself walking past the warehouse again. The mats were being scrubbed, the air heavy with disinfectant. Cain and his men worked with mops and buckets, punishment assigned by Abrams himself. Daniel's jaw clenched with every stroke of the mop. Vega muttered under his breath. Rix worked silently. Cain scrubbed hardest of all, his pride burning hotter than the sweat on his brow. Rachel didn't stop, didn't speak, but her eyes caught his just for a second, and in that second she saw it not hatred, not even anger, but a question, the same question that had followed her all her life. Who is she? She walked on, boots steady, shoulders square, let them wonder. Because the truth was coming. And when it did, the warehouse fight would feel like nothing but a prologue. How long can someone pretend to be ordinary once the truth has been spoken aloud? Rachel Keane had asked herself that question before. In Kabul, after a mission that left 6 men alive who should have been dead. In Poland, when NATO commanders whispered her call sign like a legend passed in smoke-filled rooms. In Germany, when young recruits stared at her with wide eyes after she dismantled 3 instructors in a training demo. Every time she had told herself the same thing: disappear, step back, let the moment fade. But Fort Wexler wasn't letting this one fade. By sunrise the next day, whispers had hardened into stories, and stories had a way of traveling faster than orders. She had no rifle, no pistol, took them apart with nothing. They said 79 seconds. I swear it was faster. Colonel Abrams called her Falcon. What the hell does that mean? Rachel heard them wherever she went. The mess hall, the motor pool, the firing range. Soldiers who hadn't looked at her twice now shifted in their chairs when she entered. Some nodded, tentative, testing if she'd acknowledge them. Some just stared, their faces a mix of respect and unease. She returned none of it. A nod here, a flicker of eye contact there. That was all. Respect earned by spectacle was fragile. It could evaporate as quickly as it had come. She ate her meals quickly, alone. She walked between buildings with steady pace, eyes always moving, cataloging exits, vehicles, choke points. Not because she expected trouble, but because that instinct never left. Still, the shift pressed in on her. She didn't like it. And neither did Cain. She saw it in the way he moved across the compound. His stride was sharper now, as though each step was a reminder of the mat under his back. His shoulders hunched slightly, the arrogance dented but not destroyed. Men like him didn't crumble easily. They rebuilt themselves, usually out of anger. His team mirrored him. Vega avoided Rachel entirely, slipping out of hallways when she entered. Rix carried himself with stiff silence, no jokes now, his pride scarred. Daniels, older, wiser, kept his composure, but his eyes held something new: calculation. Not hatred, not even resentment, something colder. They hadn't forgotten. Humiliation left bruises deeper than the body. And she hadn't forgotten either. That night, lying in her bunk again, Rachel found herself staring at the ceiling, the silence louder than the day. She remembered the look in Cain's eyes when she'd taken his weapon. Not fear, not yet, but the crack of realization. That moment when arrogance met reality. Her mind drifted, against her will. Back to another warehouse. Not plywood walls and sim rounds. Real walls, real bullets. A place no one on this base would ever hear about. She remembered the smell of dust and smoke, the weight of a borrowed rifle in her hands, the sound of shouting in a language she barely spoke. 4 men, armed, confident, certain of victory, and her, alone, cornered, no weapon in reach. She remembered how it ended. The crack of joints, the heavy silence afterward, the way her team had stared at her, wide-eyed, unable to reconcile what they'd just seen with the quiet woman they'd underestimated. That was the day Falcon had been born. And that was the day she'd realized how heavy a call sign could feel. She shifted in her bunk, forcing the memory down. The barracks were quiet. Some soldiers snored softly. Others shifted in restless sleep. She stared at the dark ceiling until her eyes grew heavy. Morning came too fast. At the training field, she found herself shadowed by whispers again. Young recruits watching her movements during drills. Not openly, just enough for her to feel it, like gravity had shifted. They weren't watching Cain anymore. They were watching her. And Colonel Abrams. He was waiting. She found him on the bleachers overlooking the PT yard, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He didn't summon her. He didn't have to. When she walked by, his voice carried just enough to stop her steps. "Falcon." She froze. Slowly she turned. "Sir," she said, her tone clipped. He studied her for a long moment. His silver eagles caught the sun. His expression was unreadable, a commander's mask. "You handled yourself yesterday." "I handled the exercise, sir." A faint smile tugged at his mouth. "Is that what we're calling it?" Silence stretched. Around them boots pounded on asphalt, voices carried cadence, but here the air felt still. Abrams leaned forward slightly. You know what happens when names resurface. The wrong people hear them, the wrong doors open. Are you ready for that? Rachel's jaw tightened. I'm not Falcon anymore. His eyes didn't waver. That's not how it works. She said nothing. She didn't trust her voice. Abrams stood, straightening his jacket, his presence commanding. Walk with me. They moved side by side across the field, soldiers glancing up as they passed. Abrams kept his voice low. You think you can bury it, that call sign, that history, but you don't get to choose what sticks. Men like Cain needed to see it. This base needed to see it. And if I know command, they'll be making calls already. She stopped, her boots planted on the cracked pavement. I didn't ask for this. No, Abrams agreed, but you didn't refuse it either. Her silence was answer enough. Listen, he said finally, softer now. There's more coming. Training exercise maybe, joint op maybe. They'll want Falcon, not Keane. And when that happens, you'll have a choice to make. She looked away. The horizon shimmered with heat, the distant outline of hangars blurring in the sun. A choice, always a choice. But choices came with costs, and she'd paid enough already. Abrams left her with that thought, his boots crunching across gravel as he walked back toward the offices. Rachel stayed there for a long moment. The cadence calls echoed faintly. Sweat trickled down her spine. She breathed in the sharp scent of fuel and dust. The Falcon shadow loomed closer. By evening, Cain approached her, not with swagger, not with jokes. Alone, his hands clenched at his sides, his eyes sharp. You set us up, he said quietly. Rachel turned her head slightly. Excuse me. You let Abrams play you against us. That wasn't training. That was a damn exhibition. Her expression didn't change. You asked for it, Lieutenant. His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might say more, but he just shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and walked off. She watched him go, her mind already shifting, already calculating. Cain wasn't done. Humiliation cut deep, and men like him didn't heal easy. And Abrams was right. Calls were being made. Somewhere beyond Fort Wexler, phones were ringing, reports filed, decisions brewing. The Falcon was back on paper. Whether she liked it or not. What earns someone a name that never dies? Rachel hadn't chosen Falcon. It had been given to her. A single word passed from one soldier's lips to another, then carried across borders, whispered in units she never trained, places she'd never set foot. She'd spent years trying to escape it, but memory has its own way of holding on. That night at Fort Wexler, lying awake while the barracks settled into silence, the past crept back like smoke under a door. She tried to resist it. She stared at the ceiling, counted the lines, listened to the soft snores and shifting beds around her. But memory doesn't ask permission. It takes you where it wants. And suddenly she was there again. A city that no longer had a name. Dust thick in the air, power lines sagging overhead, the sound of distant gunfire rolling like thunder through the streets. Her boots pounded broken concrete as she followed her team through the maze of alleys. Falcon 6, someone shouted. She turned, instinct taking over before thought. A figure emerged from a doorway, weapon up, eyes wide. She moved faster than the man could blink. A pivot, a strike, the rifle knocked away, his balance stolen, his body hitting the wall hard enough to shake plaster loose. Her knife, not her rifle, not her sidearm, just cold steel, pressed to his throat before he could even draw breath. He froze, the fight drained from him. Her team surged past, barely slowing, trusting her to handle it. They always did. But it wasn't that moment that haunted her. It was what came later. The mission had been simple on paper. Extract a captured NATO officer held in a safe house near the city center. Intelligence had warned of 6 hostiles. There were 12, armed, waiting. Her team breached. Chaos exploded. Gunfire rattled walls. Shouts in English, Arabic, broken commands, screams. She moved through it like water. Rifle up, fire, pivot, strike. She felt the weight of her body working faster than fear. Every move had been rehearsed 1,000 times, but this wasn't rehearsal. This was survival. 3 minutes in, 2 men on her team were down. One hit in the leg, the other pinned under collapsed rubble. The mission threatened to unravel. She remembered the commander's voice in her ear. "Falcon, clear the south corridor." That was the first time she heard it. Falcon, not Rachel, not Keane. Falcon. The name caught, heavy, unfamiliar, but there was no time to argue. She cleared the corridor alone. 4 men, 4 rifles, close quarters, no room for hesitation. Her rifle jammed on the second shot. In training, that meant a reset. In reality, it meant death, unless. Her body moved without asking her permission. Knife from her belt, a slash across the forearm that sent a rifle clattering, a knee into ribs, an elbow cracking bone, a disarm, a choke, a throw that slammed a man into the wall so hard his skull rang against concrete. 79 seconds. That number would haunt her too. 79 seconds, and 4 men lay unconscious or groaning on the floor. Her rifle was cleared, her team was alive, the corridor was secure. And the officer they came to rescue, breathing, alive. Her team stared at her when it was done, not with relief, not even gratitude, with something else. "Oh, Falcon," someone whispered again, and it stuck. But Rachel hadn't felt awe, she felt nothing. Nothing but the faint tremor in her hands as she reloaded her rifle, the sick twist in her gut as she looked at the bodies on the floor. They would live, most of them, but that wasn't the point. The point was what her team now saw when they looked at her. Not a soldier, not a teammate, something sharper, something dangerous. From that day on, her call sign spread. She became the one they called when the odds were impossible. The one they sent into the rooms no one else wanted to enter. The one they trusted to do the job, but never quite trusted to be ordinary again. She remembered a night months later, rain pounding against the roof of a NATO safe house. A young recruit had approached her, wide-eyed, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. "Is it true," he asked, "that you took 4 men with nothing but a knife?" Rachel had stared at him for a long moment before answering. "It's true, I survived." But the recruit hadn't cared about survival. He cared about the story. And that was the part she hated most, the story. Because the story grew bigger than the truth. In the story, she was invincible. In the story, she was unstoppable. In the story, Falcon was a legend. But legends don't wake up shaking in the middle of the night. Legends don't count the faces of the men they dropped in 79 seconds. Legends don't wonder if they crossed a line they can't uncross. Rachel did. And that was why, years later, she'd walked away. Now, lying in her bunk at Fort Wexler, she felt the weight of that call sign pressing down again. Falcon. Abrams had said it like a challenge, like a reminder, and the whispers around base were already growing into stories. She turned onto her side, shutting her eyes tight. But memory wasn't done with her. She saw another mission, a safe house in the mountains. Her team pinned down, the exit blocked, smoke thick in the air, radio static hissing in her ear. A man had grabbed her from behind, arm around her throat, pistol digging into her ribs. She remembered the moment of stillness, the way time seemed to freeze, the world narrowing to a single choice. And she remembered what she did. Her body dropped, pivoted, weight shifted, elbow shattered his jaw. The pistol skittered across the floor. Her knife slid free, cold against his skin, before she realized she'd even moved. Another name whispered in her ear after that, not Falcon this time, Ghost. She hated them both. Because both names reminded her of what she'd lost, the ability to simply be. She opened her eyes again in the darkness of the barracks. Around her, soldiers slept, ordinary soldiers with ordinary worries, fitness tests, drill evaluations, paychecks sent home. And she carried a past that didn't fit in the daylight. The Falcon shadow loomed, and she knew deep down that the past never stayed buried, not forever. Morning would come, orders would come, and sooner or later someone would decide the world needed Falcon again. How do you hide from a shadow when it already lives inside you? Rachel tried. She followed the routine, the rhythm of Fort Wexler's days as though nothing had changed. Wake before dawn, PT, inspections, training rotations. Chow. She moved with quiet precision, never rushing, never lagging. She stayed invisible where she could, fatting into the structure of the base like any other NCO. But invisibility doesn't last when the story grows louder than silence. By now, the story wasn't just whispered. It was spoken openly, sometimes in front of her, sometimes behind her back, always carrying that same mix of disbelief and admiration. 4 of them in under 2 minutes. 79 seconds. They said Abrams called her Falcon. That's not just some nickname, is it? She ignored it all, kept her face unreadable, but inside each word landed heavy. She didn't want Falcon back, not here, not anywhere. She wanted the simplicity of being Staff Sergeant Keane, competent, professional, respected in her own quiet way, nothing more. But Fort Wexler wasn't built for quiet. The commandos hadn't forgotten either. Cain moved through the compound like a man carrying a wound that wouldn't heal. His eyes tracked her when they crossed paths, no longer mocking, no longer arrogant, harder now, sharper. Rix kept his silence, but tension clung to him like armor. Vega had shrunk into nervous avoidance, muttering less, bouncing less. Daniels alone carried himself with some restraint, but even he watched her differently. Not as a teammate, not as an equal, but as a puzzle he hadn't solved yet. They didn't speak to her again, not directly, but their silence was louder than words. And then there was Abrams. He didn't hover, didn't call her into meetings or stand over her shoulder. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. When she caught his eyes across a training yard, she saw it there. Calculation. Not cruelty. Not manipulation. Calculation. The mind of a commander who'd seen a weapon sitting unused and couldn't help but reach for it. She avoided him when she could, but you can only avoid a colonel so long. The summons came in the form of a folded slip, handed by a runner at morning chow. Her name written neat across the top, one line beneath it. Command Office, 1400. She knew what it meant before she even read it. By the time the hour came, she'd already braced herself, boots polished, uniform immaculate, her face a mask of calm. She knocked once on the office door, crisp, sharp. Enter. The colonel's office was neat, papers stacked with mathematical precision, maps pinned to the wall behind his desk. Abrams sat with his sleeves rolled, reading a folder. He didn't look up until the door closed. Sergeant Keane. Sir. He gestured to the chair opposite. Sit. She did back straight, hands folded, eyes forward. He studied her for a moment, then set the folder aside. You've been the talk of this base. With respect, sir, she said evenly, I didn't ask for that. No, he agreed, but you didn't stop it either. Her jaw tightened, she said nothing. Abrams leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. I told you before, names resurface for a reason. Falcon doesn't stay buried, not when command gets wind of it. She felt the shift then, the heaviness of his words. The folder on his desk wasn't about training schedules. It wasn't about routine base politics. It was something else. What's in that file? She asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. He tapped his fingers once against the folder, then slid it across the desk. Read. She opened it. Photos, grainy satellite images, maps marked with red circles, and faces, blurred but unmistakably hostile, notes scrawled in tight handwriting. Phrases jumped out at her. Possible weapons transfer, rogue cell, high risk for U.S. assets in region. Her stomach tightened. She knew this language. It wasn't training talk, it was operational. "This isn't my assignment," she said firmly, closing the folder. "It wasn't," Abrams said, "until yesterday." Her eyes flicked up to his, cold, steady. "You planned this." He shook his head once. "I didn't plan anything, but I knew the moment they saw Falcon again they'd come asking, and they did." Rachel's pulse thudded in her ears. She leaned back slightly, her breath slow, measured. "I'm not Falcon anymore." Abrams's voice stayed calm, quiet, but firm. "Tell that to command. See if they care. They want results, Sergeant. And when they want results, they call for the one who's proven she can deliver them." The words landed like stone. Rachel looked down at the folder again. She didn't want to touch it, didn't want to see the maps, the faces. But she knew. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she already knew. The shadow was back, and shadows didn't disappear on command. "What's the mission?" she asked finally, though her voice carried a hint of resistance. "Extraction," Abrams said. "Not unlike what you've done before. High-value intelligence source embedded in a hostile cell. The kind of job that requires subtlety, speed, precision, and the ability to neutralize multiple armed opponents in confined spaces." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She could hear the unspoken words. The same words she'd heard 10 years ago. The words that had birthed Falcon. "You." "Not alone," Abrams added as though sensing her thought. "You'll have a team, not mine, not Cain's, specialists, but they'll be relying on you. That's the way it's written." She sat in silence for a long moment, staring past him at the map pinned to the wall. A city marked in red, streets she didn't know, shadows waiting. "You should have said no," she murmured finally. "I did," Abrams said simply. "They overruled me." That truth stung more than she expected. He leaned forward now, his voice lower. "You think I want to put you back in this? I've seen what it does, I know what it costs, but I also know this: there are some fights that don't wait for our permission, and this one has already begun." She rose slowly from the chair. Her boots felt heavier than they had all day. "Permission to speak freely, sir." He nodded. Her voice was steel. "I'll do the mission, but I'm not Falcon, not to them, not to anyone. If they want a name, they can use mine." Abrams's eyes flickered. He gave the smallest nod. Understood. But she knew. The moment the wheels touched down on foreign soil, the name would follow her, whether she wanted it or not. She left the office without another word. The folder stayed behind. The shadow didn't. Outside, the compound pulsed with its usual rhythm. Cadence calls, boots striking asphalt, laughter from the mess, engines rumbling, the ordinary sounds of a military base. But Rachel felt none of it as ordinary anymore. Because somewhere in the silence of her own mind, she heard it again. Falcon. Not a name, not a title, a weight. And the world had just decided to put that weight back on her shoulders. What do you pack when you're carrying ghosts? Rachel laid her gear out on the narrow barracks bed, piece by piece, boots polished, belt adjusted, holsters empty now but waiting for steel, every buckle tightened with deliberate precision, every strap checked twice. Her hands moved like a ritual, but inside her chest carried the slow thrum of something she didn't want to name. Not fear, not yet, but the weight of inevitability. Around her the barracks buzzed with ordinary noise, recruits swapping stories, boots clattering across the floor, the low hum of laughter. None of them knew she was leaving that night. None of them knew the orders had already come down. To them, she was still just the army sergeant who'd embarrassed 4 commandos, a story to pass along, a rumor to whisper. But when she looked down at the empty holsters, she saw something else, a reflection of the past, of years when her gear was never just gear, when every strap carried memory, when every mission demanded more than it gave back. She closed her eyes briefly. Inhale, exhale, the same breath she'd taken before dozens of deployments. Then she finished packing. The hangar was lit with floodlights, engines already rumbling as the transport idled on the tarmac. Rachel walked across the asphalt, her rucksack slung over her shoulder, the night air carrying the faint tang of jet fuel and dust. Shadows stretched long under the harsh lights. The team was already assembled near the ramp. 4 operators she didn't know. Civilian clothes under tactical vests, rifles slung across their backs, each carrying themselves with the wary confidence of men who'd been here before. But their eyes lingered when they saw her. Not hostile, not mocking, curious. The leader stepped forward, hand outstretched. Early 40s, weathered face, quiet authority. "Major Holloway," he introduced himself. "You must be Keane." "Sergeant," she corrected quietly, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, professional. He studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod as if confirming something for himself. The others introduced themselves in turn, Callan tall and lean, eyes sharp as a hawk, Ortiz heavier set, with hands that looked like they'd been broken and healed wrong, Mercer, youngest of the 4, restless energy simmering beneath calm eyes. Each one glanced at her with the same unspoken question. "Falcon." She gave them nothing in return, just a steady nod. Holloway gestured toward the transport. "Let's get inside, we'll brief en route." Rachel followed, her boots clanging against the ramp, the echo swallowed by the roar of engines. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of fuel and metal. She strapped in, her gear tight against her frame, her eyes settling on the folder Holloway opened across his lap. Maps, photos, faces, the same she'd seen in Abrams's office. "High-value source," Holloway said, his voice steady. "Embedded deep. Intelligence says they're moving him in the next 72 hours. We don't have the luxury of waiting. We get in, secure him, get out, fast, quiet, clean." He glanced at her then, his tone shifting. "We've been told you're our close quarters lead." Rachel's jaw tightened. "That wasn't my request." "Wasn't mine either," Holloway said simply, but the colonel insisted. The men shifted slightly. No one spoke, but their eyes told the story. They'd heard, everyone had, the warehouse fight. The name Abrams had said aloud. "Falcon." Rachel leaned back in her seat, gaze steady, voice quiet. "You don't need to believe the stories, just stay on task." Callan smirked faintly, the first to break the silence. "Stories don't knock 4 SEALs flat in under 2 minutes. That was you, wasn't it?" She didn't answer. Ortiz gave a low chuckle. "Guess we'll find out if the legend's real." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, letting their words pass without anchoring. She couldn't fight the story. Not anymore. All she could do was survive it. The transport rumbled down the runway, engines screaming as the wheels lifted. Gravity pressed them back into their seats, the base falling away into shadow. Rachel stared out the small window, the lights of Fort Wexler shrinking into dots. For a moment, she let herself feel it, the distance, the separation, the line between before and after. But even as the base disappeared beneath her, she knew the past wasn't left behind. Because Cain was still there. She'd seen him before leaving, standing at the edge of the hangar, arms crossed, watching the transport prep. His eyes locked on her, hard, unreadable. He hadn't spoken, but his silence had said enough. "You humiliated me. You stole something I can't get back." She knew that look. She'd seen it in other men in other places. Resentment curdled into something sharper. Cain wouldn't forget, and he wouldn't forgive. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight she had another. Holloway leaned closer, his voice pitched low under the drone of engines. "I don't care what name they use for you. Falcon, Keane, doesn't matter to me, but you should know this, we're walking into a hornet's nest. My men need to believe you can get us out alive. Don't give me words, give me proof." Rachel's eyes met his, steady, calm. "You'll have it," she said simply. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once and leaned back. The cabin settled into silence. The hum of engines filled the air, steady, relentless. The men closed their eyes, conserving energy, each lost in his own ritual before deployment. Rachel sat still, her thoughts a storm she refused to show. She remembered other flights, other nights, the weight of expectation pressing down like armor, the way her hands had trembled once, hidden under gloves before the ramp dropped and reality swallowed her. She flexed her fingers now, no tremor, not yet. She closed her eyes briefly, and in the darkness behind them she saw the warehouse again, not Fort Wexler, not plywood, the other warehouse, the one in that nameless city years ago, the moment Falcon was born. She opened her eyes before the memory could finish. The ramp would drop soon enough, the fight would come, and when it did, she knew what everyone expected. Falcon. She wasn't sure she had the strength to prove them wrong. The transport roared on into the night, slicing through darkness toward a place where silence would mean death. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the layers of discipline and denial, Rachel felt it stir again. The thing she had buried, the thing she didn't want, the thing they wanted her to become. Falcon. What does it feel like when the name you buried rises in your chest again? For Rachel Keane, it came in pieces, in the low hum of the transport cabin, in the weight of the rifle now pressed against her chest, familiar and unwelcome, in the sharp nod Holloway gave her when the red light flicked on. It came in the silence of four men glancing at her not as a stranger anymore, but as the one they'd been told to follow. She had wanted to be invisible. She had wanted to be just another soldier. But as the transport descended into darkness, the truth was heavy on her shoulders. They weren't looking for Sergeant Keane. They were waiting for Falcon. The ramp lowered. Heat and dust rushed in, carrying the smell of oil and smoke. Night swallowed them whole. The safe house was a half-collapsed structure on the edge of a broken street, its windows boarded, its roof sagging. Intelligence said their target was inside, a man who knew enough about weapons transfers to shift entire wars if he spoke in the right ears. And guarding him were men who would rather burn the place to ash than let him go alive. Holloway's hand signals cut sharp through the dark. The team moved like shadows, hugging walls, boots soft against cracked concrete. Rachel kept to the rear, her rifle up, her senses stretched thin. Every creak, every flicker of light, every echo of voices inside the building hit her like alarms. They reached the entrance. Holloway pressed against the wall, listening. Voices carried inside, harsh, foreign, sharp with tension. The sound of a chair scraping, a cough, the unmistakable click of a weapon being set down. Holloway's eyes shifted to Rachel. Her heart kicked once hard. This was the moment. She stepped forward, her boots silent, her hands calm. The Falcon part of her didn't ask permission anymore. It just moved. She pushed the door with controlled force, sliding inside. The air smelled of sweat and dust. The corridor was narrow, shadows swallowing its edges. Two men sat at a table halfway down, rifles slung across their shoulders, eyes bleary from fatigue. They didn't see her until it was too late. Her hand clamped the first man's rifle, twisting, her knee slamming into his thigh. He dropped with a grunt before his voice could rise. The second man surged, reaching for his weapon, but her elbow cracked against his jaw, snapping his head sideways into the wall. His body slumped, his breath ragged. The others flowed in behind her, covering corners, securing the hallway. 79 seconds. The number rose in her mind again, unbidden. But this wasn't a drill. This wasn't plywood walls and an audience above. This was silence and blood, and the knowledge that hesitation would cost lives. They cleared room by room, shadows shifted, voices shouted, doors flew open, gunfire rattled, deafening in the confined space. Rachel moved through it like water, precise and relentless, rifle up, fire, pivot, strike. Her body remembered every angle, every joint, every pressure point. In one room, a man lunged from behind a desk, blade flashing. She stepped inside his arc, grabbed his wrist, twisted until his knife clattered to the floor. He gasped in pain, his knees buckling as she shoved him down, her boot pinning his chest. She didn't look at him again. Her team moved with her, their rhythm tight, their trust growing with each step. Callan covered her flank without question. Ortiz cleared the stairwell with practiced calm. Mercer's shots cracked precise, dropping threats before they could raise alarms. Holloway's commands were quiet, controlled, steady. And Rachel felt Falcon in her veins again. Not as pride, not as arrogance, but as inevitability. The final room held the target. A man bound to a chair, gagged, his eyes wide with terror. 3 guards stood over him, weapons ready. Holloway signaled, 3 fingers. Rachel nodded. She slipped inside first, low and silent. The first guard never saw her. Her rifle butt cracked against his temple, dropping him instantly. The second spun, weapon half raised, but a burst from Callan dropped him before he could fire. The third shouted, raising his pistol. Rachel lunged, her hand striking his wrist, twisting until the shot fired harmless into the ceiling. Her other hand slammed into his sternum, driving him back, pinning him against the wall until the pistol clattered free. And just like that, it was over. The target's eyes darted from one soldier to the next, then fixed on Rachel. He didn't know her name. He didn't know Falcon. But in that moment, his gaze told her he saw something he couldn't understand, a quiet soldier who had walked into a storm and left calm in her wake. Holloway cut the ropes, hauled the man to his feet. Move. The team exfiltrated fast, the night pressing close, engines already roaring in the distance. They piled into the waiting transport, the target shoved between Ortiz and Mercer. Callan covered the rear as Rachel took the last step up the ramp. The transport lifted, dust swirled. The safe house shrank behind them, another ghost in a long line of ghosts. Inside, the cabin was heavy with silence. The target muttered through dry lips, words Rachel didn't bother to decipher. The men breathed hard, their gear streaked with dust and sweat. Holloway looked across at her. His eyes carried no disbelief now, no hesitation, only acknowledgement. "Falcon," he said softly, not as a question, as a fact. Rachel didn't answer. She just looked away, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside the window. Because she knew what they didn't. Falcon wasn't a name you carried without cost. Every mission like this carved another line inside you, invisible but deep. Every second you survived came with a weight. She could still feel it now, the press of her boot on a man's chest, the echo of a rifle butt against bone, the sound of bodies dropping into silence. She would carry it back with her, back to Fort Wexler, back to the barracks where recruits whispered, back to the hallways where Cain's eyes still burned. But this time she knew there was no burying it again. The shadow was out. The world had seen Falcon rise once more. The transport droned on into the night. The men settled, exhaustion pulling them down. The target slumped, alive but broken. Holloway closed his eyes, his faith now given. Rachel sat still, hands folded, eyes open. She thought of the recruits who would stare tomorrow. She thought of Cain's clenched jaw. She thought of Abrams's calculating eyes. And she thought of herself, the girl who once wanted only to belong, the soldier who became something she never asked to be, the woman now known by a name she couldn't escape. Falcon. But as the night stretched on, she felt a different truth settle in her chest. Maybe Falcon wasn't a curse. Maybe it wasn't a mask. Maybe it was simply proof that silence could be strength, that dignity didn't need words, that respect could be earned without demand. She closed her eyes then, letting the hum of the engines wash over her. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.